The blood of the builders, DNA and the truth behind the pyramids. Archaeologists found, when they excavated a settlement site near the Giza Plateau in the 1990s, known as Hayt el Ghurab, the physical remains of a community that had been hidden under desert sand for 4,500 years. A workers' town complete with bakeries, breweries, medical facilities, administrative buildings, and a cemetery, whose skeletal remains have since become the primary biological evidence for answering one of archaeology's most persistent questions. Who actually built the pyramids? The question has attracted more mythology than almost any other in the ancient world. The Hebrew Bible's account of Israelite bondage in Egypt, combined with the sheer scale of the pyramid construction, produced a mental image of slave labor that dominated Western popular culture for centuries. Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 film, The Ten Commandments, fixed that image so firmly in the public imagination that it persisted long after Egyptologists had concluded it was almost certainly wrong. The pyramids of Giza were built during the Old Kingdom period, approximately 2550 to 2490 BCE, and the Israelite presence in Egypt, if it occurred, is associated with much later periods of Egyptian history. The excavations at Hayt el Ghurab, led by Egyptologist Mark Lehner, beginning in the 1980s and continuing into the 2000s, revealed a planned settlement capable of housing somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people. The workforce that built the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the Pyramid of Khafra, and the Pyramid of Menkaure. The cemetery adjacent to this settlement, where workers were buried with the same orientation and care applied to other ancient Egyptian graves, provided the skeletal material from which DNA and bioarchaeological analysis has since been conducted. Genetic analysis found, when researchers examined ancient DNA from skeletal remains associated with the Giza pyramid builders, genetic profiles consistent with the broader ancient Egyptian population identified in other studies of the period, confirming that the people who built the Great Pyramid were indigenous Egyptians, biologically connected to the populations of the Nile Valley and the ancient Near East, with no evidence of the large-scale imported labor that the slave theory required. The DNA work on pyramid builder remains builds on the broader Abu Sir el-Malek study published in 2017, which established baseline genetic profiles for ancient Egyptian populations spanning approximately 1,300 years. The pyramid builder samples from the Old Kingdom period several centuries earlier show ancestry patterns consistent with the Levantine farming populations and North African hunter-gatherer groups that contributed to the ancient Egyptian gene pool across the Neolithic and Bronze Age periods. The absence of genetic signatures from populations that would be associated with enslaved foreign labor, sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, or distant parts of Asia, is consistent with what the administrative and archaeological record already suggested. Egyptian administrative texts from the Old Kingdom period describe a rotating labor system in which agricultural workers from across Egypt were conscripted for defined periods of service on royal construction projects, housed and fed at state expense, and then returned to their communities. This was taxation in labor, rather than slavery in the chattel sense. The DNA comparison between the worker population and the royal mummies from the same period shows the genetic continuity expected of a society in which the ruling elite and the general population drew from the same regional gene pool, different in social status, but not in fundamental biological origin. Physical evidence found in the workers' cemetery at Giza, excavated systematically by Zahi Hawass and his team beginning in the 1990s, produced skeletal remains whose forensic analysis tells a story about the daily lives, health conditions, and medical care of the pyramid builders that contradicts almost every popular assumption about what their experience was like. The most discussed individual from the workers' cemetery, is an adult male whose skull shows a large healed lesion consistent with a serious blunt force injury, the kind of wound that, without treatment, would have been fatal. The bone had remodeled around the injury site in a pattern consistent with survival for months or years after the initial trauma. Bioarchaeologists interpreting the remains concluded that this individual had received skilled medical intervention. The wound had been cleaned and treated in a way that prevented the infection that would otherwise have killed him. This single skull is more informative about the pyramid builders than many pages of theoretical reconstruction. It tells us that the construction site had medical personnel capable of treating severe head injuries. It tells us that an injured worker was kept alive and cared for, rather than abandoned or disposed of. It tells us that the workers were valued enough as individuals to receive significant medical resources. Women and children were present at the site. The cemetery contains graves of adult females and juveniles alongside the adult males, indicating that the workers lived at Giza with their families rather than as isolated labor gangs. The burials follow standard ancient Egyptian funerary practice. Bodies positioned in a fetal-like posture, oriented toward the west, the direction of the setting sun and of the Egyptian afterlife, and accompanied by modest grave goods, including pottery and stone objects. Isotope and residue analysis found, when researchers examined the chemical composition of animal bones, pottery residue, and human skeletal material from the Hayt El Ghurab settlement, evidence of a diet provided to the pyramid builders that was, by the standards of the ancient world, extraordinarily protein-rich. And that goes a long way toward explaining how human bodies were able to sustain the kind of physical labor that moving millions of tons of limestone required. Zooarchaeological analysis of the animal bone deposits from the workers' settlement, conducted by Richard Redding of the University of Michigan, found that the assemblage was dominated by cattle, sheep, and goat, domesticated animals whose presence in the quantities documented implies deliberate large-scale provisioning rather than opportunistic hunting or small-scale household consumption. Redding estimated that the equivalent of approximately 11 cattle were slaughtered daily to feed the workforce, a quantity of beef protein that most ancient populations, and many modern ones, would have found extraordinary. The presence of fish bones in the settlement deposits indicates that the Nile's aquatic resources were also incorporated into the diet. Bread and beer, the foundational staples of ancient Egyptian nutrition, are documented through ceramic analysis and through the recovery of bread molds and brewing vats in the settlement's food production areas. Ancient Egyptian ale was thick, nutritious, and low in alcohol relative to modern beer, functioning as a caloric supplement rather than primarily as an intoxicant. Stable isotope analysis of the worker's skeletal collagen, which records the dietary signature of the years immediately before death, is consistent with the high-protein dietary profile indicated by the faunal remains. The isotopic data shows that the builders ate substantially better than most ancient Egyptian commoners, whose diet was more heavily grain-dependent. Bioarchaeological analysis found, when researchers examined the skeletal remains of pyramid builders in detail, a pattern of physical trauma and degenerative disease that documents the cumulative cost of a working life spent moving stone at a scale that has never been matched in human history before or since. Osteoarthritis, the degenerative joint disease caused by chronic mechanical stress on cartilage and bone, is present in the pyramid builder skeletal assemblage at rates and severities that are elevated compared to other ancient Egyptian populations. The lumbar vertebrae show compression and degeneration consistent with repeated heavy lifting. The shoulder joints show wear patterns indicating sustained overhead and lateral force application. The knees and hips show the effects of years of carrying heavy loads across uneven terrain. The average age at death for the pyramid builders estimated from skeletal maturation markers, was lower than for the Egyptian population as a whole, reflecting the accelerated physical deterioration that sustained heavy labor produces. Estimates from the Giza cemetery suggest many workers died in their 30s, with some in their 20s. The bones that document their labor also document its cost in years of life. Healed fractures are common in the assemblage. Forearm fractures, the classic defensive injury from falling objects or from the impact of misdirected tools, appear at elevated frequencies. So do foot and lower leg injuries, consistent with being struck by slipping stone blocks. The ancient Egyptian medical papyri, including the Edwin Smith papyrus, describe treatments for exactly these kinds of injuries with a clinical precision that suggests extensive practical experience. The workers' cemetery provides the patients whose injuries the papyrus was written to treat. Archaeological and isotope evidence found in the workers' cemetery at Giza documents a burial tradition that combined the standard conventions of ancient Egyptian funerary practice with elements that appear to be specific to the construction worker community, reflecting a social world in which shared labor and shared religious belief intersected in ways that left their mark on how the dead were treated. Several burials from the workers' cemetery contain tools alongside the deceased: stone hammers, copper chisels, and other implements of construction work. The inclusion of occupational tools in burials is documented in other ancient Egyptian contexts and is understood as reflecting belief that the skills and implements of one's working life would be useful or meaningful in the afterlife. For a man who had spent his life cutting and moving stone, the tools of that trade were as personal and as significant as any jewelry or ritual object. A small number of burials from the Giza workers' cemetery contain mud brick miniature structures, model homes or storage facilities placed near the body. These objects are consistent with the broader ancient Egyptian practice of providing the deceased with miniature representations of the material goods and spaces they would need in the afterlife. Their presence in the workers' cemetery, alongside the standard grave pottery, indicates that these were people embedded in the full religious and cultural life of ancient Egypt, not a marginalized or excluded underclass. The orientation of the burials, consistently westward toward the setting sun, places the construction workers squarely within the same cosmological framework as every other ancient Egyptian of the period. They died in the belief, shared with the pharaohs whose monuments they built, that the west was the direction of the dead, and the dead were not gone. Administrative records found preserved in the Eastern Cemetery at Giza, graffiti inscribed on the walls of royal tombs, and administrative structures during the construction period provide direct written evidence of how the workforce was organized, named, and motivated, adding a social dimension to the biological picture the DNA and skeletal analysis provides. The pyramid builders were organized into named gangs, permanent work crews of approximately 2,000 men each, given names that expressed loyalty and pride in their royal patron. Gangs working on the Great Pyramid of Khufu included groups called Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkaura. These names are not administrative labels, but expressions of identity, suggesting that the workers thought of themselves as members of a named community, rather than as interchangeable units of labor. The graffiti recorded by Egyptologists at Giza includes what appear to be competitive boasts between rival gangs, evidence that the construction was, in some sense, a competitive enterprise in which different work crews measured themselves against each other. This is the psychological infrastructure of motivated labor rather than coerced labor, and it matches the administrative records that document workers being rewarded for productive work. Ostraca, pottery sherds used as writing surfaces, found at nearby sites, document worker absence records that are among the most detailed surviving evidence of everyday life in ancient Egypt. The reasons recorded for worker absences include illness, injury, religious duties, and family obligations, including attending relatives' funerals. The absence records document a workforce with rights, relationships, and obligations outside the construction site, people, not property. Material analysis found in the tools, transport implements, and construction debris of the Giza Plateau has, when combined with DNA analysis of the timber used in pyramid construction, produced a picture of the technological and logistical knowledge that made the pyramids possible. A knowledge base that was transmitted through families and communities across generations. The question of how the pyramid builders moved blocks of limestone weighing between 2 and 80 tons has occupied researchers for centuries. A painted scene from the tomb of Jehuti-Hotep, a Middle Kingdom official, shows a large statue being transported on a sled while a worker pours liquid, almost certainly water, in front of the runners. Experimental physics analysis, published in Physical Review Letters in 2014 by a team from the University of Amsterdam, confirmed that wetting sand in front of a loaded sled reduces friction by approximately 50%, making it possible to move heavy loads with considerably less force than dry sand requires. The artwork is not decorative. It is an accurate depiction of a known engineering technique. Cedar wood from Lebanon, identified by species analysis of wooden objects and tool handles from Old Kingdom contexts, appears consistently in Egyptian royal construction projects across the pyramid building period. The cedar trade between Egypt and the Levantine coast is documented in both Egyptian administrative records and in the archaeological record at the Phoenician port of Byblos, where Egyptian votive objects have been found spanning the Old Kingdom period. The logistics of importing cedar from Lebanon to Giza involved maritime transport, port facilities, and overland movement that represent a supply chain of international scope. Paleopathological evidence found in the skeletal remains of the pyramid builders, combined with ancient DNA analysis of microbial material from burial contexts, documents the disease environment of a large construction camp operating in the Nile Delta climate, an environment that combined the health hazards of heavy physical labor with the epidemiological risks of dense human settlement near a major tropical river. Malaria, caused by Plasmodium falciparum and transmitted by Anopheles mosquitoes that breed in the Nile's irrigation channels and flood zones, was endemic to ancient Egypt. Evidence of malaria infection has been detected in ancient Egyptian mummies through DNA analysis of Plasmodium genetic material in bone tissue, including in royal mummies from the New Kingdom. The pyramid builders, living in a large settlement near the Nile during the Old Kingdom period, would have been chronically exposed to malaria transmission. Intestinal parasites, including schistosoma, which is transmitted through contact with Nile water, are documented in the paleopathological record of ancient Egyptian populations across multiple periods. Workers who spent their days hauling stone near the river's edge would have had significant exposure. The resulting chronic parasitic infection contributes to fatigue, anemia, and reduced physical capacity, factors that the administrators of the construction project would have had to account for in their estimates of daily labor output. The so-called curse of the pyramid builders, occasionally referenced in popular accounts, has no ancient Egyptian textual basis equivalent to the pharaoh's curse associated with royal tomb opening. What the microbial DNA analysis of burial contexts does confirm is the presence of ancient pathogens, including fungal species of the Aspergillus genus that can cause respiratory illness in people with compromised immune systems who disturb sealed, undisturbed burial environments. Scientific synthesis found across the bioarchaeological, genetic, and administrative literature on the Giza pyramid builders presents a picture of ancient labor organization that is more sophisticated, more humane, and more interesting than either the slave narrative or the alien intervention theory that have occupied popular discourse about the pyramids for most of the past 2 centuries. The DNA evidence confirms what the archaeology had been suggesting since Hawass and Lena began systematic excavation in the 1980s. The people who built the Great Pyramid were Egyptians, genetically connected to the population of the Nile Valley, embedded in the religious and social structures of their civilization, fed and housed and medically treated by the state, and buried with the same care and the same orientation toward the setting sun as every other ancient Egyptian of their time. The administrative record fills in the human detail. These were men with names and gang identities who boasted of their productivity and competed with other crews, who were absent from work to attend funerals and observe religious holidays, and who were catalogued in lists that their overseers kept with the kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that ancient Egypt brought to everything it organized. What the pyramid builders created was not just architecture. They created the largest stone structures ever assembled by human beings, using technology that was entirely within the reach of human ingenuity, organized by an administrative system that understood how to motivate and maintain a workforce of tens of thousands across decades of continuous construction. Their DNA flows, in diluted and recombined form, through the population of modern Egypt. Their achievement stands on the Giza plateau as it has stood for 4,500 years, not as the work of gods or aliens, but as the work of people.